Hello and welcome to the talk Grasslands of Eurasian Dry Grassland Group. My name is Ala Alexanyan. I am a leading researcher in the Institute of Botany of National Academy of Sciences of Armenia, and I am a deputy chair of EDGG, responsible for organization of conferences and talks. I hope you all know that Eurasian Dry Grassland Group is one of the biggest group of the researchers and conservationists from working with the grasslands. We are more than 1,300 members from 64 countries, and our focus is not only dry grassland, but all natural and semi-natural grasslands across Palearctic region. And usually we organize conferences, workshops, special features, and different scientific journals, and we'll publish our own journal called Palearctic Grasslands. Our membership is free of charge, and you can join us if you are not a member yet. Here you can find in my slide email of our membership administrator, Idoya, and you can communicate with us using our website or other social media platforms like a Facebook group or a YouTube channel. We came with the idea to organize these winter talks after canceling our usual conference in 2020, and we decided this is a good opportunity to stay engaged and informed in the latest developments in the grassland studies. And we already had one talk in December, and this is the second one. I will just a little bit explain the structure. First, we will listen to talk, and after that, we will have a separate question and answer session, and Didam Amberley will facilitate it. So you will have a chance to raise a hand and ask your question to our speaker, Milan Chytrý, today. Or you can write your questions throughout the whole talk in a chat section of Zoom platform. And after finishing talk, Didam will pick up a few questions and will ask to our speaker. Please keep in mute your microphone so we will have an opportunity to hear a clear voice of our speaker. And I want to welcome Milan Chytrý and say a big thanks from EDDG to join us today. And we are very excited to hear from you today recent developments of the EUNIS classification of European habitats. And a few words just about the Milan Chytrý. He is one of the biggest ecologists of Europe, and he is interested in vegetation survey and classification, in plant invasion, in broad-scale patterns of plant species diversity, and also in habitat conservation. He's a chief editor of Journal of Vegetation Science and Applied Vegetation Science. He's a secretary of IAVS Working Group of Vegetation Survey, European Vegetation Survey, and he's a coordinator of European Vegetation Archive. So, floor is yours, Milan. Welcome once again, and we're ready to hear you.
Yeah, thank you, Ala, for introducing me, and thanks to the Dry Grassland Group and Didam for this invitation. I will try to share screen. So today I will talk about the topic that we were working with an international team of colleagues from European Vegetation Survey for already about 8 years. And this is the revision and development of expert system for EUNIS habitat classification. EUNIS is an acronym. It means European Nature Information System, and it's an information system that is managed by European Environment Agency, and European Environment Agency is supported in the development of this system by European Topic Center on Biological Diversity, which has a seat in Paris. And it's a group, it's an international consortium of several institutions that are supporting European Environment Agency in different tasks related to monitoring of species, of natural habitats, etc. And you can find EUNIS at the website of EEA, European Environment Agency. It's important to say that EUNIS is not only habitat types. I will be talking about habitat types today, but EUNIS also includes other levels, especially species level, and the level of sites of some conservation importance in Europe. So you can explore this website. There are still many gaps, but European Environment Agency is working towards closing these gaps. In this talk, I will first briefly reiterate the history of European habitat classifications and also the history of EUNIS classification. Then I will tell you something about our own work on the update and parameterization of EUNIS. Then I will present here what we developed, an expert system for classification of EUNIS habitats. We show you the outputs that we produced using this expert system. And finally, we developed everything for the use by experts, and I would like to show you how you yourself can use this expert system and how to apply it to your data. Expert system, which we call EUNIS SCS, means expert system for EUNIS. Habitat classifications in Europe started to develop already before the foundation of European Union. In the 1980s, it became clear that it's important to coordinate somehow the development and storing of information on the environment in Europe. European communities, not yet European Union, in the 80s started a project called CORIN, which is an acronym for Coordination of Information on the Environment. And within this CORIN program, there was a group in Belgium of a few biologists led by Pierre de Villers, who developed the first habitat classification for the European community, basically for Western Europe at that time. But it was, I would say, pretty inconsistent at the time. Pierre de Villers himself was mainly an ornithologist, so he was not himself working on phytosociology of vegetation. And still, phytosociological vegetation types became the core of this habitat classification of European communities. So in 1991, they published what they called CORIN Biotopes Manual. And this became a very important document because some of the habitats defined in this document were taken to Annex 1 of the European Habitats Directive. Habitats Directive was adopted in 1992, and it became the core, the basis for the establishment of Natura 2000, of a network of protected areas for the future European Union. And most of you, I think, know Annex 1 of Habitats Directive, which is the list of natural habitat types of community interest. And the first such list was taken from this Biotopes Manual which was at that time very inconsistent collection of different concepts from the literature. This habitat classification was developed further, and De Villers and his team added new types from Eastern and Central Europe. It became Palearctic habitat classification, but again, it continued to be somehow inconsistent collection of all the possible concepts. This Palearctic habitat classification was used by the Berne Convention on the Conservation of European Wildlife and Natural Habitats, which is an initiative of Council of Europe. So it's broader than European Union. Council of Europe includes also countries that are not members of the EU. And under Berne Convention, Council of Europe started to develop so-called Emerald Network. And again, many of you are, of course, familiar with Emerald Network. Some of you are working on establishment of this network in your countries. So that's a network protected areas outside European Union. And the first list of habitats that is used in Emerald Network is different from that used in EU Habitats Directive, and it was taken from Palearctic habitats classification. Now the Emerald Network a couple of years ago took already EUNIS classification, which I will be talking about today, but unfortunately a version which is not no longer up to date now. And after the establishment of European Union and establishment of European Environment Agency, it became clear to people in the agency that these initial habitat classifications have to be improved, have to be developed more consistently according to some clearer criteria. And this is when EUNIS habitat classification started in the mid-1990s. European Environment Agency organized a workshop in which already several people from phytosociological science were invited. And in 1998, the first version of EUNIS habitat classification was published. It was coordinated at the time by people, Cynthia Davis, Dorian Moss, people from the Institute of Terrestrial Ecology in Britain. But during the development of EUNIS, already our colleagues from European Vegetation Survey, such as John Rodwell, Sandro Pignatti, and some others, were involved. And they were working towards giving some more scientific background to the habitats in EUNIS by linking them to phytosociological alliances. Because phytosociological alliance is something that is defined. There are some relevance behind an alliance. There are tables. So you can go to literature and you can see what is meant. And the result of their work was published in 2002 in this brochure called The Diversity of European Vegetation. But it was difficult because at that time we still didn't have any consolidated list of European alliances. It was published only in 2016 with Eurovec checklist. EUNIS was further revised. For the revision, already the results and experience from this exercise with linking to alliances was used. So there were further versions. And since 2012, we were invited, I mean European Vegetation Survey, a working group of IAVS, with core groups from Wageningen, Joop Skamina and Stefan Hennekens, and our group from Masaryk University in the Czech Republic, and also John Rodwell as independent scientist from Lancaster, UK. And they were interested, I mean, the agency was interested especially in updating the crosswalks to alliances, because they understood it was important really to have phytosociological background for habitat types. We were also asked to provide input into revision of this classification, because there were some units that were still unclear, there were some overlaps, etc. So there was clearly an attempt to improve it, and especially they needed to characterize the UNIS types, and the two key elements for this characterization was producing the lists of indicator species, because it's important to know which species occur in which habitat, and also to produce distribution maps so that we know where these habitats occur. An important input into this work was also preparation and then ultimately publication of so-called Euro-habitats checklist, which is the first consolidated list of European vegetation units to the level of alliance, with about 1,100 alliances dominated by vascular plants in Europe, published in 2016. And when we started to work on the revision of UNIS, we also produced a revised simplified typology based on UNIS, which was used in European Red List of Habitats in its terrestrial part, which was incidentally also published in 2016 and led by John Janssen and John Rodwell. So this Red List of Habitats already used the first version of our updates and revision of UNIS. The current structure of UNIS is briefly outlined here. UNIS is a hierarchical classification. It's important. It has several hierarchical levels, but only the three top layers are somehow consolidated and are revised, while all the lower levels, fourth, fifth level, there are some types, but these are somehow inherited from the previous habitat classifications, like Corine, like Palearctic habitats, and they are more or less collections what was found in the literature, but we can't imagine it as some sort of consolidated product, with the exception of marine habitats. So, well, what I would recommend and what we are using now is going to the third level of this hierarchical classification. And on the first level, there are 10 broad groups, starting with marine, coastal, etc., which were originally coded from A to J, but now the revision which is undergoing is really substantial. So it was decided in EEA to change also the coding of these units at the highest hierarchical level. So now they are no longer A, B, C, D, etc., but they are M, N, P, Q, etc. So this hierarchical view of UNIS classification on the EEA website is already outdated. You can recognize the old UNIS from the new revised UNIS based on these codes, whether they start with M and higher letters, or whether they start with the letters that are at the beginning of the alphabet. So now what we did for UNIS, and who did it? So I'm reporting on the work that was done by this team which included two excellent programmers, Lubomir Tichy from my group at Maastricht University. He programmed JUICE, a program for analysis of vegetation flow data. And within JUICE, there is an expert system for classification of vegetation and habitats, which I will be still talking about. And Stefan Hennekens from Wageningen in the Netherlands, who is a program of TurboVeg, and he programmed all the technology for creating European Vegetation Archive, which became a database on which we were working during all these revisions of EUNIS. Then Joop Schamine, who was coordinator of all these projects for European Environment Agency, he negotiated, wrote all the reports to the agency. And then John Rodwell, who was a sort of person providing conceptual input, and also has very broad knowledge of different vegetation types and different habitat types. So he made a substantial input for the revision. Here he is with Doug Evans. Doug was not a part of the team Stricto. He was working in a European Topic Center, and he was always working as a sort of reviewer of our work from the position of agency, and he provided excellent input into what we produced. He always gave comments very to the point, and he helped us a lot over all this process. And Ilona Knolova in our group in Brno, who is the manager of European Vegetation Archive. She's excellent in managing large data sets, and without her it wouldn't be possible to work with those huge data sets that we were using. And there were many more people. I might mention especially John Janssen, who led the project of European Red List of Habitats, that was somehow let's say running in parallel with this revision, or people who revised large parts of EUNIS habitats, like Tomáš Peterka developed the part of expert system for Myers, Corrado Marceno and Flavia Landucci did a lot of work on Mediterranean types, or Jiří Danihelka, who revised huge lists of species from national TurboVeg databases, revised nomenclature, taxonomic concepts, etc. There were also people from European Environment Agency, Mete Palic, Tranja Spiropoulo, and Eleni Trifon, who were really helpful. They were officers of the agency, but very keen into this work and very supportive. And then, in a later stage, we invited more than 80 people from European Vegetation Survey and European Vegetation Archive to provide feedback on the work we prepared. And they were fantastic, because they went through the outputs that we were producing, and they were giving very detailed comments. And I must say, I learned a lot from this huge cooperation with so many people. And it also means that the product we produced is now applicable not only like roughly on a coarse European scale, but it can be also applied to regions, because it was reviewed by people who have local or regional knowledge. In a blog post to VEC blog, I called our work as filling empty boxes with hard data. Why? Because the problem was that EUNIS habitat classification, as it was created from 1990s to early 2000s, was a set of empty boxes, let's say, of classes or categories that had name, that had a code, but then hardly anyone could see what is inside each of these categories. It wasn't clear what was the content of species, which is the species composition of individual habitats, what's ecology of these habitats, what's distribution. And it was one of our tasks to fill these empty boxes with hard data. If you want to use more scientific language, you can say that we were parameterizing these classes. And our focus was on characteristic species combinations for each habitat and geographic distribution. Our solution to this issue of filling the empty boxes was to use European Vegetation Archive. European Vegetation Archive is a database, a centralized database of the European Vegetation Survey Group, which was established in 2012 by chance in the same year as we started to work for EEA. And currently it contains more than 1.6 million vegetation plots. You see the distribution here, or density of plots across Europe and some adjacent areas. And currently we have 95 partner databases. So we thought, okay, we would take all this database, the largest source of data for European habitats, actually, and let's assign these plots to EUNIS habitats. And when we have plots assigned to EUNIS habitats, we can use some statistical tools and derive lists of indicator species for each habitat, and of course map the distribution of the plots assigned to individual habitats. But there was problem already here, how to assign individual plots or relevance to EUNIS habitats, because such a classification has to be consistent across the whole of Europe. And you know that in different European countries, there are different traditions of vegetation or habitat classifications. Even within the brown blanket approach, there are different regional or national traditions. So such a classification, if it was taken from the database, for example, how individual relevas are labeled by the name of habitat types in the database, it would be pretty inconsistent across Europe. Then we couldn't use what was in the database, because we already had classification that was defined. It was EUNIS classification. We had classes that were already established. So we couldn't take any classification, or we couldn't take all the plots and classify them from scratch. We needed some supervised approach, which means basically matching individual plots to already established types. And also, all this issue had to be technically manageable, because I don't know how many of you have ever classified 1.6 million plots, but believe me, it's like technically and computationally very demanding task. So it's not easy at all. You often need to run it on some server. So our solution to this issue was developing an expert system, classification expert system, which we called EUNIS SE, EUNIS Expert System. First, what is expert system? Expert system is some computer system which works, which tries to imitate or emulate human decision making. In this case, decision making in classification. If we are classify objects, I mean us humans by our brain, we are doing some decisions in the brain. And we were trying to tell computer how we are doing these decisions and try to make computer to do the decisions for us for 1.6 million plots in a short time, which wouldn't be possible to do by hand or by our brain. Expert systems in general are composed of two basic components. One is knowledge base, it's facts and rules. In the description of classes, facts and rules are, let's say, lists of species that characterize individual habitat types, or lists of species that tend to occur together, etc. And then you need what is called inference engine, which is basically a computer program which will apply these facts and rules about definitions of types to the data. So then you use some input data. In our case, it was relevance, vegetation plot records in the computer, apply facts and rules to this input data, and you get output, which in our case is classification, assignment of each single releva of 1.6 million to a vegetation type or to habitat type. We used this approach, which was pioneered by our colleague Helga Brühlheide already in the 1990s, when he developed so-called cocktail method. It's a sort of such expert system. And we took over this method when we were starting our work on a national vegetation classification of the Czech Republic. We somehow updated it, and then we obtained quite some experience when we were working on our Czech national vegetation monograph, Vegetation of the Czech Republic, published between 2007 and 2013 in 4 volumes. We defined almost 500 vegetation associations in this monograph, and what is important, each of them was defined formally in an expert system. So we tested these expert systems for several years, because already before we started to publish the first volume, we had several years of testing of expert systems. So then we were ready to apply expert systems already to also to European data, but habitat types at a European scale is something a bit more complicated than associations at the national scale. So it needed some more technical developments. We worked on it especially with Flavia Landucci, who produced new rules and new methods of classification within this expert system knowledge base during her work on a species poor aquatic and marshland vegetation. And the latest development was published in 2019 in our paper with Lubomír Tichý in Journal Vegetation Science. And in this paper, there is an electronic appendix. And in this electronic appendix, there is the whole description of the syntax of language for expert systems for vegetation or habitat classification, which we now call ESSI language. So the knowledge base of this ESSI language is composed of 3 parts. You can imagine it as a text file. Yeah? So this is this knowledge base where the rules and facts about how vegetation types or habitat types look like is stored, is a simple text file, txt file, and it has 3 sections. The first section is solving species nomenclature and taxonomy. So, for example, if you have in your data Abies borisii regis and Abies borisii regis indicated as a hybrid, then you have to merge it because this is the same concept. Or you have several subspecies of the same species, and you also have some typos in the database, like here. You merge it into this name. So this is done automatically. This is done for several hundreds of names automatically before you apply this expert system to your data. So you don't need to edit species nomenclature manually. Then there is second section in this file which defines species groups. Species groups can be defined, for example, biogeographically. Like here we have Mediterranean species of Pinus. These four are Mediterranean Pinus species, or these are this is ecological group of bog herbs that occur in bogs, and then the inference engine, the computer program, looks at the data that you submit and looks at each single plot and looks for the total cover of species group of each of these group and number of species in the plot which belong to the group. So this is the basic information that you can obtain from the plots. And then the third section is the definition of individual habitat types. So here I have some shrub type, thermo-Mediterranean scrub, or some dry grassland type, semi-dry perennial calcareous grassland. This is Brachypodium or Bromion grassland. And there are logical operators like and, not, or, which define that for a relevant, for a vegetation plot to be assigned to the habitat type, for example, two species groups must occur together, or some groups may not occur. So here it says, like TC, for example, is total cover of Mediterranean maquis shrubs is greater than 25%, which defines this shrub. At the same time, these thermo-Mediterranean maquis shrubs are have greater cover than all the other shrubs, with the exception of these maquis shrubs. And because we want to define a shrubland type, trees can't have cover greater than 10%. Yeah? So this is one possibility based on the total cover of a species group, which we used for definition of especially forest and shrubland types. For grasslands, we used a bit different approach, because in grassland you usually don't have a single dominant. In Brachypodium grassland you can have many different dominants, and it's important that all the group of Brachypodium grasslands is more numerous or has higher total cover than a group of any other grassland type. So this syntax here with #Q, I certainly don't go into detail, but it means that we have for each grassland type a list of species that are typical for this grassland type, and then we look at each single releva and look at the total cover or the total number of species belonging to a group of individual grassland habitat types. And then the grassland type, which is most represented, for example, that has the highest cover or highest number of species for this type, is the final type. So it's decided about the classification. And also we have definitions for broad types, like whether it's a grassland or whether it's a forest, which is quite often very useful to have such definitions. Then what is important in the habitat classification, we not only base the definitions on species composition or species cover, but also in some types, not all of them, but in some habitat types, the classification is also based on location or geographic attributes. Because if you look into EUNIS, you have types like coastal habitat types, like grey dunes, and you have inland types. And you can find in EUNIS that you have Atlantic and Baltic coastal dune grassland, grey dune, which is, from the phytosociological point of view, it's coryneforion. But then you have inland type, inland habitat type, which is called inland sand drift and dune with silicious grassland, which is again coryneforion, but it occurs inland. This is how it is defined in the EUNIS. Because there is the basic distinction between coastal and inland grasslands. So a releve for this habitat type and this habitat type can be completely identical. What separates them is the position on the coast or inland. So we have to add some information about whether it occurs on the coast. So you see there is information whether it's on the coast, Atoll coast, Atlantic coast, the Baltic coast, or whether it doesn't occur in the coast. Here, N coast means not on the coast. So this is also important information that we need. If we applied this expert system to just phytosociological classification, this wouldn't be necessary. But for habitat classification, sometimes it's inevitable. We constructed this expert system, and then we applied it to the whole EVA database and produced some outputs. Last year, after 8 years of work, finally, we published a paper which has 99 co-authors. And these are mainly people who provided a lot of comments and also data, people from European Vegetation Archive and European Vegetation Survey. So in this paper published in Applied Vegetation Science, it's open access, everyone can download it. You can find the description of the expert system. But what is important, there's a lot of products in the supplementary material, and we also opened a site at Zenodo. Zenodo is a repository for scientific information, and we expect we will update, and we already updated the expert system. And it doesn't make sense, of course, to produce a new paper for each update. It would be silly. So we will publish all the new updates in this Zenodo. There will be a timestamp, a date, so it will be clearly versioned. And if you download this, the download is free. You will always know that you are working with version with this and this number, which you can use for your work. So it will be in Zenodo. So what is ready so far? When I take the 10 basic categories of EUNIS, there is category marine, and somehow unexpectedly, coastal salt marshes, which we consider often as grasslands, are included in marine habitats, together with the habitats of sea bottom and others. But anyway, we define these using vegetation. There are 11 types, and we completed this work just recently in November. So it will be, it's not a part of the paper, it will be added very soon to Zenodo. Then coastal vegetation, it was completed, 25 types, and it's published in the paper. Then the biggest group, which still remains unfinished, is aquatic group, because aquatic habitats are currently under revision. There is a big discussion within European Environmental Agency and the Topic Center. And there will be, those of you who are using EUNIS have to be prepared that there will be a dramatic change in aquatic habitat definitions, because there are also other groups of stakeholders, like people from the Water Framework Directive, who use more physiographic criteria for definitions. So aquatic habitats will be defined mainly on whether it's still water or running water, then whether it's large or small water body, whether it's lowlands or mountains, and whether it's nutrient rich or oligotrophic. So this is not under revision, but there will be hardly any phytosociological types that could be identified based on vegetation plots. Then wetlands are largely completed. They were published in the paper, but we will have in the near future at ephemeral wetlands like Isoeton Anoinset vegetation, because this was originally part of this aquatic vegetation, and with the revision they will be excluded and they will be added to wetlands. And then grasslands are completed. Grasslands are the largest group in EUNIS. It contains 55 habitat types at the third hierarchical level. Shrublands are completed, published, forests completed, published. In November, another group that we finished is inland sparsely vegetation, sparsely vegetated habitats. It's 26 types, and man-made habitats, agricultural and rural, were also completed and published. So in total, what we have completed is 236 types of EUNIS at the third hierarchical level. All of them are in the expert system, and what will be added will be just a few types of ephemeral wetlands, and maybe some more from this aquatic part, but largely the work is finished already now. Then I want to draw your attention to these habitat fact sheets. They are also part of the supplementary material to the paper, but I know few people are reading or looking at supplementary materials. But this supplementary material is quite important. You can find it also in Zanodo. It's 500 pages of some basic first version of European Habitat Manual of EUNIS, because we generated here for each habitat type a sort of fact sheet with short description, so the textual definition. Then there is a map, this desert steppe. So these red dots show where we found desert steppe in the data we have. The green part, it's the area from where we have grassland data. So to show all distribution of all the grasslands, to show we have grasslands here, but none of these grasslands is desert steppe, and desert steppe occurs only here. Then there is a list of alliances from Eurovec checklist that correspond to this habitat type. And there is this characteristic species composition, which is based on the analysis of EVA data. So characteristic species compositions were derived statistically from the groups of vegetation plots that were classified by the expert system to individual habitats. So this is a screenshot of the JUICE program. You see here a sort of synoptic table after classification by the expert system. And we are applying some statistical measures of fidelity, like phi coefficient, to identify which species are diagnostic, constant, and dominant for different habitat types. We distinguish these three groups of species. Diagnostic species are those that are more or less restricted to the habitats, that those species that by their occurrence define the habitat. They don't need to be very common in the habitat. Some of them are not, some others are, but they have to occur mainly in the habitat, but not so much elsewhere. Then constant species are those that are common in the habitat, commonly occurring there, but they can also occur in other habitat types. So they are not so good indicators of the habitat, but they are very important for the physiognomy of the habitat. And dominant species are those that often have high cover in the habitat. So these three species groups together form what we call characteristic species combination. So in the fact sheets of habitats, you see it like here. So here is a habitat of Nardus stricta grasslands, the lowland to mountain type. And you see the diagnostic species. They are listed together with the phi coefficient. The higher the phi coefficient, the higher the concentration of species occurrence in the habitat. So not surprisingly, Nardus stricta is on the first place, but you see also the others. These are constant species, and you see here species like Avenella flexuosa or Calluna vulgaris, which also occur in other habitats, many other habitats, but are very common in Nardus grasslands. And dominant species, of course, Nardus stricta, but all of this is based on the statistical analysis of more than 1 million vegetation plots. And then, very straightforward is that when you have vegetation plots classified by the expert system, then you can export their geographic coordinates either to Google Earth to explore it or to some format for GIS and produce the maps like this. I already said this is the map for Nardus stricta grassland, and always for each group of habitats like forests, shrublands, grasslands, we plot in the background with green color where we have data and what's the density of the data, because it's quite important for interpretation. Unfortunately, we still don't have much data from large areas of Europe, especially in the north and the east. And the last part of this talk, I just want to give you some tips how you can use this expert system yourself. So let's say you have your own data, you have a national or regional or your own database of vegetation plots, and you want to classify these plots to EUNIS habitats. So you have three options, basically, three inference engines that our team developed. First is JUICE program, second TurboVec 3, and the third is R. JUICE program was developed by Lubomír Tichý, my colleague in my group in Brno. And here in JUICE, you open a data set with plots. So you have vegetation plots in columns, you have species in rows, and here you click on analysis. There is expert system. You open that text file that I showed you the structure with the definitions of types and run it. And after a few seconds, or if you have millions of plots like we have, it can take some hours. Originally, it took many days, but was improved it constantly. So now it takes maybe 4 hours to classify all this data. And the result is here that for each column, the code of EUNIS classification is added to the header. So you can sort the table by the headers, and you will have groups of relevance of plots belonging to the same habitat type. Then you can use TurboVec 3. Most of you, unfortunately, will not be able to use TurboVec 3 because it's a program by Stefan Hennekens. It's already finished, but it's commercial program. Stefan still needs some time to cover the expenses that he invested into writing this program, so it's sold commercially. But if you had the chance to work with TurboVec 3, you can do this classification directly in TurboVec 3. And hot news, we just have an accepted paper. It's an R script, which was developed by Helge Brilheide and Florian Jansen, with some input from Lubomir Tichy and myself. And it's already available at a Git server of Rostock University in Germany, where you have the code, data, and this EUNIS expert system file. So those of you who prefer to work with R, you can classify your plots also with R, and soon there will be a paper published about this. Before you apply the data, I have to make one warning. You have to take care about your species taxonomy and nomenclature. So in Zenodo, you will need this file, this txt file with the definitions of EUNIS habitats. Then please, I know most people don't do it. I also don't like to read the manuals, but there is a user's guide. And please read this user's guide if you want to have correct classification, because otherwise it will classify somehow, but the classification may not be correct. So follow the instructions in user's guide, which is available for free in Zenodo. And we prepared the files with nomenclature translations from TurboVec 2 databases. So if you use TurboVec database for your vegetation plots, then go to Zenodo, and there is this set of files which you can apply through the expert system routines in JUICE, for example. And so, for example, if you are like Euskadi Basque Country and you are using Basque Country dataset, you have the nomenclature of the Basque Country, and you take this file, open it in an expert system option of JUICE, and modify your data, modify the nomenclature of species in your data. And when you do it, you will receive your data set with the nomenclature that is expected as input for the expert system. And only then you can run the expert system. So please don't forget about this, otherwise you may have classification with errors. But this is prepared for basically all the data sets that are used in Europe within TurboVec. So this is all. I hope I inspired some of you to look for our outputs or for the expert system. And I will be happy if you have any questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Milan, for this very interesting and very informative talk. So now it's time for question and answer session. I should ask Tidem to facilitate it.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Alla. Thank you, Milan, for this very comprehensive talk. So I will suggest the participants, you can either write down in the chat option, or please you can raise your hand in the participants option. So please use raise hand option of the Zoom. because then I can find you easily, hopefully. Okay, Anna, please.
Hello, everybody. Hi, Milan. Thank you very much for excellent presentation. And can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I can. Yeah. Hello, Anna.
Hello. I have one question from Valentin Golu. He asked why vegetation scientists, phytosociologists are so active in habitat classification, but other people like geographers, zoologists are not so active in this area. What do you think?
I'm not sure whether I can answer for geographers and zoologists. Currently, I know because I was somehow participating in the discussions also for revision of these aquatic habitats. There, limnologists are very active now. So people related to hydrology, people from the Water Framework Directive. So they are taking initiative there. And regarding zoologists, I was working with zoologists when we were working on the red list of habitats of the Czech Republic. And I must say, it's we wanted to somehow define the habitats so that they are useful for animals too. But this is very important. They're very difficult because, like, animals are moving first, and they are somehow perceiving landscape at very different scales. So, for example, large carnivores, they need huge areas where there are several different habitats that are repeating in the landscape, while other animals like invertebrates, they are related to small pieces of dead wood in forest, or dead wood, or some types of stones in on the bottom of rivers, etc. So for zoologists to define a habitat is very tricky, and there is no single classification for habitats of animals, I'm afraid. So I think zoologists are a bit burdened by this issue.
Thank you, Milan. And I also have one small question from my side. We used this EUNIS SE expert system for all Ukrainian open habitats, and we faced with some problems with inland sands and qualified habitat types, because we have a lot of plots in our database, but it was defined only as R on the first level of hierarchy. What do you think? What can be reason for this situation?
Well, as I said, it's like open work, and we are planning to update the expert system. So it's possible that when we were working on it, we mainly considered species from Central and Western Europe, and some species from Eastern Europe were not included because we didn't have enough data. But if you think that the classification could be improved by adding some habitat specialists from Ukraine, Russia, or I don't know, Anatolia, the areas that were not so well considered because of lower density of the data, you can tell me, you can send suggestion, and I can add it to the expert system and test it with the data, maybe send you the result, whether it fits your expectation in terms of classification, and we can improve it in this way and publish new version in Zenodo.
Thank you, Milan. I will send you my suggestions. Thank you very much once again.
Okay, now there is a comment for the first question from Doug Evans. He says that marine habitats revised by marine specialists and based on fauna rather than flora in deep water. So
yes, that's right. Of course, marine habitats, but I'm you know, from a landlocked country. I'm always thinking in terms of terrestrial habitats.
Yeah, of course.
But good comment. Thank you, Doug.
So there is a question from Philip Perrin, and he says that this is a great progress and very useful. What is the timeline for the completion of aquatic and ephemeral sections?
Well, it depends on the talks within European Environment Agency. So I can't tell, but I think if everything goes well, then I think we could at ephemeral wetlands this year. But we can't do it before the decision in EEA is taken. And it's not like simple because they have IONET, they have their group of experts and stakeholders. So they always open consultations online. People can send comments to them. Then they have workshops, discussions. So they are very careful about all the possible stakeholders and representatives of the member states are involved, and only based on this they can make the decision. So this is nothing what would depend on me or colleagues from European Vegetation Survey. We have to follow what the agency decides and wait for the final decision.
Okay. Jürgen Denkler has a question. He will ask himself.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Hello,
yeah. Thank you, Milan. Could you say something on the rate of plots that could not be classified or could only be classified to the first level of the hierarchy? And did this level of unclassified plots differ between the different habitat types?
Well, in the study that is published, I think 92 plots were classified, and to the third hierarchical level, about more than 60% of plots were classified. But you have to consider that it included, like the data set included totally everything. And some habitat types like these ephemeral wetlands were not defined. So this, we can say some percentage, but it's not very informative.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, then there are two related questions. So the first one is from Giovanni Riviecho and asking, Habitat Directive classification and EUNIS, do they need to be harmonized? And the second question from Lubos Halada, and a lot of phytosociological data was used for EUNIS revision and update. How close are now EUNIS and phytosociological classification in different vegetation formations?
Yes. So the first question, so the relationship between Annex 1 types and EUNIS, it's a big problem, I think, because the habitats on Annex 1 is a legal document, and in individual countries there are already nature reserves established based on the occurrence of these habitats. So if someone would change the list of habitats in Annex 1, it would have legal consequences, which may not be very good, because it might mean that someone would argue that some area is no longer worth protection because the habitat that was the reason for its protection is no longer there because it was changed. So I don't see much perspective for merging this classification of Annex 1 and EUNIS. But EUNIS can be used for monitoring, other kinds of reporting, and regarding the second question, which is the link between EUNIS habitats, because it was our aim to make more connection between phytosociological types and EUNIS. So also in the revisions that we were working on, we were often preferring or pushing concepts that were corresponding to phytosociological units. So this will be improved now.
Okay, I think the question is answered now. And okay, so by the way, if you would like to ask your question yourself, you don't need to write it down in the chat, but you can just write, I have a question, or just raise your hand. But I will continue to read 2 more questions, then I would like to finish question and answer part, because I don't want to keep all of you here for another hour. So there is a question from Mario Ducon, and it is, hi, we can see many changes in new UNIS classification. For example, Carpathian travertine fens with halophytes are classified as a separate unit, very rare and endangered. It is used to be included within more widespread Pannonian salt steppe habitats. Does it have a higher EU added value for conservation project preparation, for example, a LIFE project? Does anyone know? Thank you. And how can we work with this changed classification?
Yes. So during the revisions, it was it was a bit unclear whether these Carpathian fens are more saline types or whether they are fens. And also in the phytosociological literature, there are different approaches. Originally, they were classified with halophyte vegetation. Now they are classified as fens. So this is a transition type, but very unique for the Carpathians. So after some discussion within the group of Meyer experts, it was added to the classification. And whether it has some value for the management, it depends on local authorities or local conservation groups, whether they put higher emphasis on these types.
Okay, so in the chat, it is interesting because Milan, your colleagues are answering some of the questions already, so I am not repeating it to you. It's very nice.
Mm-hmm.
And another question from Alicia Acosta: what about plots heavily invaded by aliens? Aliens are clearly the dominant species.
Yes, they in some cases such plots belong to man-made habitats, so they are already defined as invaded, and of course you can still identify habitat types based on their species composition. And you can see that, well, expert system will identify, let's say, a grassland habitat, even if it's invaded, as this habitat type. And then you will have some data, some plot records, for example, that will be invaded, and others will be uninvaded. So it should be, let's say, robust. The classification should be robust to the presence of alien species, perhaps except the stands where some species totally dominates the area. But then it would be classified in most cases to man-made habitats, to anthropogenic types.
Okay, I think it's time to end the question and answer session. So I will ask Alla to close this talk. And thanks a lot from my side again to Milan and all the participants for this very interesting talk. And now we have more than 100 participants, and they are most of them are colleagues that I miss a lot. So it's good to see you even virtually, let's say.
Okay, thank you, Didem. Yeah, from all of us, once again, thanks, Milan Chytrý, and thanks to all for participation in our winter talks. I hope you can join our next talk, which will be on 4th of February, and we can hear a lot about ancient and modern grasslands. Thank you again, and have a nice day. Bye.
Okay, thank you very much for inviting me, and well, I didn't expect so many people to come, so it was really pleasure to have this talk. Thank you, and
yeah,
see you somewhere. I hope not virtually, but like personally. See you.
So